I'm Miss Mary Borg, and today I'm sitting down with Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, a friend of myself and my family's, to discuss Africa and some of her experiences and opinions about Africa. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your career?
Sure. Well, I'm currently teaching at the University of North Florida with your mother, actually, who is a close friend, and so I'm delighted to do this. My career has been a great one. I started out working in the U.S. Senate, worked on a number of presidential campaigns, and got lucky enough to work for one who won, which was Bill Clinton in 1992. Worked as the number 3 person on the National Security Council during many of the Africa crises, Rwanda, Somalia, all sorts of crazy things. And then was an ambassador at the United Nations after that, and have worked for a number of nonprofits dealing with crises prevention around the world in foreign policy. And I'm delighted to bring some of my expertise and experience to your class, and I hope they'll consider going into public service. It's a great, really wonderful career. You can travel around the world working for the State Department, take an internship, and encourage your students to go for it, because any of them, the United States government loves people of a diverse background to come and work for them.
Great. Okay, so I want to start today by talking with you about Rwanda. I know that you have expressed your regrets about the Clinton administration's response, or the lack of response perhaps, to that crisis. But it's difficult to justify action based on incomplete information. So my first question is, at what point did you truly begin to understand the extent of the atrocities being committed in Rwanda?
Well, to your students who are just starting to study this, Rwanda is a tiny country in the middle of Africa, and I really didn't know much about it until we started hearing reports about atrocities going on there. I was at the White House at the time, and there was a small peacekeeping operation there. And we had tried to make the peacekeeping operation smaller because it was right after some other problems with peacekeeping in Africa. And all of a sudden we got a report that the 2 presidents from Rwanda and Burundi had been killed in a plane crash, and we found out later that that was the beginning of the sign for the genocide, which ended up killing almost 1 million people. We realized it was a real crisis about 3 weeks into it, in the middle of April, when we got reports and pictures of hundreds of thousands of bodies floating down this river. At that point, we sprung into action and tried to do what we could to save lives. We didn't act fast enough, we didn't act strongly enough, and I think the world has learned from that.
Okay. So of course hindsight's 20/20. Knowing what you know now, what actions would you have justified or advised?
Well, I actually thought a lot about this, and I wrote a book called The Superpower Myth in 2005. You can see me on The Daily Show on March 1st, 2005, if any of your students want to look it up. And there I went back on all the documents, all the meetings, all the cables that we had to figure out what we could have done differently. And what I learned is that once the crisis had started, it's very hard to get the U.S. government to mobilize to put a peacekeeping force in when there's no peace to keep. So you're talking about a warfighting force in a small country that we didn't really have plans for. So before you get organized, it was over. I think the mistake was back the fall of 1993, when we cut the peacekeeping mission from 5,000 to 2,500, when it was just too small to stop it. And since that time, the UN has decided that instead of sending small peacekeeping missions in, they're sending in big ones. So now they're 20,000. So had we had a 20,000 person force there, we probably could have stopped the genocide, and that's our regret. President Clinton has gone there and apologized, and interestingly, Rwanda is today one of Africa's biggest success stories. Partly because everybody felt so guilty about not doing much. They've invested in it. It's a high-tech center. It's a leader in democracy in the region. They take interns if your students want to go and work there with some of the companies or the NGOs. It's a very good, happy story now.
Great. Well, that's good to hear. And my last question about Rwanda, I'm just wondering, what do you think is the most powerful lesson that the U.S. and the world in general can take away from what happened in Rwanda?
I would say there are 2. One is you can recover. I mean, it really is a happy story right now. So the resilience of the human being is extraordinary. They picked themselves up and have built a good democracy, society. There's still problems, but people recover, and international community can help them, but the resilience of the human spirit is a lesson from that to me, for everyone. And the second is beware of the signs of genocide coming. And since the Rwandan genocide, people have worked to look at signs. There was hate radio. They were hiding weapons. There were lots of signs that we missed at the time. And now there's all sorts of global organizations to help raise the alarm bells when these signs of genocide work. One is a great one. It's called Crisis Action. It's based in London. And when they hear these signs of genocides, they send out alerts to get all the international organizations around the world to move in and stop it. And you haven't seen a genocide since then. The one problem today is in Syria, where the government itself is the one that's killing people. And I don't think we're doing enough there. You've got 200,000 that have been killed there now, and I think we need to do more. You're going to have 500,000 killed before this is over.
Yeah. All right, well, let's switch gears real quick to a more positive moment in African history in 1994. That was also the year that we saw the end of apartheid in South Africa, the system of racial segregation there, and the election of Nelson Mandela as the country's first black president. I understand that you had the opportunity to meet Nelson Mandela. When was that?
Many times.
Oh, okay.
It's one of my biggest moments in my career is meeting him and then subsequently working with him on a few issues. I worked for Senator Ted Kennedy, who's President Kennedy's brother, in the Senate for 6 years, and he was a leader in human rights around the world, and so he led the effort in the United States Congress to impose sanctions against the racist regime. It's called an apartheid system, where it was very separate and very unequal. And the people of South Africa so appreciated that effort that Nelson Mandela took time to thank me for working for that bill. And so I got to meet him right after he got out of prison. And I have a picture that he signed. It says Amandla, which was the cry of the ANC, and he signed that, thank you. And I asked him, he was locked up for 30 years for his beliefs. And I don't know about you, but if I were locked up for 3 decades, I'd be angry and bitter, and he wasn't. And I said, aren't you kind of mad? And he said, no, I was privileged to be part of a larger movement. And I've worked a lot in human rights around the world, and I've seen that time and time again. When people are wrongly imprisoned, whether it's here in the United States, I've met people in death row who've got out, who were innocent and got out. I've met people in the Irish peace process who were innocent and got out. And I've asked them all the same question, aren't you angry? And some human transformation happens, and when something that awful happens to you and you're wrongly imprisoned and unjustly treated, that you believe you're part of a bigger movement that's going to help the rest of the world down the road. In fact, most of these cases do exactly that, but no one does it better than Nelson Mandela.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true in that case. So not to downplay the part of the people in South Africa in bringing about that change, but it's widely acknowledged that international pressure also had a major role in finally bringing about the end of apartheid. And I was wondering, in what ways did the U.S. Pressure on South Africa help to bring, you mentioned policy.
Yes, I mean, there was a policy of sanctions where people who were instrumental in the repressive regime in South Africa, where they were locking up people, who wanted democracy and basically just repressing the majority of the population in South Africa, were not allowed to travel. Their assets were frozen. And the people of South Africa, Nelson Mandela himself, said that without the international sanctions, they would not have achieved democracy as peacefully or as quickly as they did. And to me, that's the strongest testament. You hear a lot of people around the world who criticize sanctions. They don't work, they don't do anything. That's just not true. I've seen it time and time again. They're not perfect, and they don't happen overnight, but over time they can change a regime's behavior. It's the reason today that you have Iran negotiating is that the sanctions were really biting. And they said, we want to get these sanctions off. Now, whether they will, whether you can trust them, are all questions, but when people say that sanctions don't work, look to Iran and look to South Africa. It had a major impact.
Okay. How do you think that South Africa can be used as a model for successfully using sanctions and other, foreign policy and things like that to bring about substantial and lasting change?
Well, first of all, it helps to have a leader like Nelson Mandela. They faced a lot of problems since he left in trying to get the communities working together, and none of the problems have been solved, but they're much, much better. But I think the symbolism of Nelson Mandela reaching out to the white community, not to ostracize them, but to make sure that everyone understood that they were valued members of the society. There was a famous movie about the soccer actually rugby. He went and played, it was an all-white rugby team, and he went and cheered them on. That was a symbol there. He worked with the government and made real compromises. So compromising with someone who you believe is your enemy is often the hardest thing for leaders to do, but it's also crucial, because if the other side feels threatened by a new government, you won't have the necessary compromise. So that was, I think, the most stunning example. The other is to not be afraid to confront the past. They had a truth and reconciliation process in South Africa where if you came forward and admitted your crimes, it helped the other side heal, and you wouldn't have to go to prison if you had that. But knowing what happened to your loved ones, knowing how someone died in prison, knowing where they went, what was the history that you lived with, is a healing process that's been critical to peace processes around the world, and where they don't do it, it's a major problem and still a source of tension today.
All right, let's skip forward to the next decade, the 2000s, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Sudan. So by 2003, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan, and particularly in Darfur, seemed to be getting a decent amount of international attention, but as you mentioned in your book, they had actually been at civil war already for a couple of decades. So what exactly changed in Sudan that finally brought more international attention to what was going on there?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that it's not over. The problems in Sudan are at the crisis point with South Sudan, which might go to all-out war. People in Darfur are still suffering. But in 2005, there was an effort to achieve a comprehensive peace agreement, and it actually worked. And the changing dynamic was that the leader of the United States, who was at the time President Bush, decided to get involved to negotiate a peace deal. The Christian community, Sudan is divided into two countries now, but at the time it was one country. The north was a Muslim country run by Bashir, who's now an indicted war criminal, who's the one who did the genocide in Darfur, and the south, which was Christian. So for 2 decades you had a war between the north and the south, Muslims versus Christians. The oil's in the south, the refineries in the north, so it's a lot about oil. And President Bush listened to the Christian community here in the United States that went to him and said, you've got to do more to save the Christians in the South. And to his great credit, he did. And he sent envoys there, he spent a lot of personal time, and when the United States leads, the rest of the world tends to follow. And he was able to secure a peace agreement, which led to a referendum in 2001, in which the South voted to be independent. So they're two separate countries now. The newest country in the world is Sudan, the 193rd. They're not going well. Their leader actually was killed in a plane crash, and that was a real loss because he was a Nelson Mandela type that could compromise, and the leadership that's followed has been less able to compromise. So there's a real risk that the two countries will go back to war. The oil sharing agreements between the two are not happening. Bashir, even though he's a indicted war criminal, is still in the capital of Sudan, running the place, still oppressing the people of Darfur. So it's a area that's really worth watching. For your students, there's a really interesting organization called the Enough Project, ENOUGH, Enough. We've had enough. And George Clooney is actually very involved in it. You can go on the web, the Enough Project, and watch videos of George Clooney looking at the violence in an area called the Nuba Mountains that has been today getting targeted by the indicted war criminal. So there's a lot more that people can do in expressing outrage, and it's a project your students might want to look at.
Great. Well, so it sounds like, you know, you were fairly complimentary of the Bush administration's response to that. If you had been a member of that administration, do you think that they responded adequately, or would you have advised anything maybe beyond what they did?
Well, it's gone into the Obama administration now. So that was in 2005. President Obama took over in 2009, and I don't think they're doing enough now. They have a special envoy, but they need to have more presidential attention to stop them going back to war. That will cause enormous humanitarian crises if they do. So I think President Obama needs to get more directly involved, or you will have a real crisis there. They're supposed to have elections coming up. There are sanctions again now about to be placed on the leadership in the South. So it's a real problem. I think we need to spend more attention. There's a lot in President Obama's inbox right now with ISIS and Syria and Iran and China and Russia, but this is something that he needs to really spend some time on. So I think they need to do more.
Okay. And you talk a lot in your book about how the U.S. and the international community are often reluctant to interfere in African internal affairs, especially when it comes to sending troops in. Do you think that that's still the case today, or has that changed any since you wrote the book?
No, I think it's still very much the case because the President of the United States, the toughest decision he has is to send our troops, our daughters and sons, into harm's way. And there is a very high bar, in my view, rightly so, to doing that. And so you have to be able to call the mom up who just lost her son and said your son's life was worth it in this cause. So we have to have clear and direct U.S. interest to be able to do that. Because we don't always have clear and direct interest in some of these African conflicts, we try and leverage that by having the UN do it, by having NATO do it. It's not just the US, we're one out of 193 countries. And so over the last 20 years, what the US has done is try and train first and foremost African troops, because they have the most interest in trying to solve these conflicts, because they're the ones who will suffer first in the region. So we've trained over 100,000 troops to be the port of first call when there's a crisis, and we've worked to support the UN peacekeeping. The U.S. has intervened militarily in Liberia because we founded Liberia. The French have intervened in Mali and their former colonies. The British tend to intervene in their former colonies. So when there's a direct link there, you'll have a direct issue. We intervened directly in Libya when there was a threat from the former dictator Gaddafi to kill the people in Benghazi and save their life, but then the country fell apart, which had a rippling effect in Mali and other places. So if you intervene in one place, you have to be prepared to stay there a very long time. We've been in Iraq since 2003, and we're still getting drawn back in there. So it's best if you can get the local troops to act, and next the UN, but then, U.S. troops are not the solution to every problem there. So I think that's the right balance.
What do you think is the biggest challenge facing Africa today?
Poverty.
Poverty.
If you look at any statistics, Africa's at the bottom. They had these Millennium Development Goals that were put forward by the UN in 2000 to cut poverty in half. And they did it by making sure that the maternal health was good, that infant care was good, that education was good, that nutrition was good. And the world met many of those targets, but lags in Africa. It's got the highest HIV/AIDS rates, and South Africa in particular was ravaged by HIV/AIDS epidemic, where you had millions of orphans because the teachers were dying, the soldiers were dying. There were estimated between 20 and 40 million orphans from the deaths of parents. And that's much better now because we've got huge programs. Lack of access to safe and clean drinking water. So you have children dying under the age of 5 on a regular basis. You have women dying in childbirth. You have war, disease, all of those are a result of poverty. So the UN is having a summit this fall to do a follow-on for the Millennium Development Goals. They're still playing with the name, but it looks like it's going to be called the Sustainable Development Goals, to try and eradicate extreme poverty, where you have people living on less than $1 a day, of which there's 1 billion people, mostly in Africa today. So that's going to be the world's challenge next. And there's lots of ways for your students to get involved. Join the Model UN. You can go up to the UN, meet people. They have regional conferences. It's one of the best things to do. Follow the debates there and get involved. A lot of the organizations push this. You can do the hashtags. And join the world debate. You have to remember, the U.S. is 300 million people. The world is 7 billion. Get to know the other. There's going to be 10 billion by the time your students are 20 years older than they are right now. And learn another language. Get out there and get engaged, because problems abroad hurt the United States. We can't draw lines against the rest of the world. They're going to come here. It's what makes our country strong. Immigration in this country keeps us strong. In fact, 40% of the Fortune 500 companies in this world were founded, in the United States, were founded by immigrants or the sons of immigrants. The person who made Apple what it is today, Steve Jobs, his father came from Syria. And we wouldn't have Apple today had we not let his father in. So it's a great message for your students to think about careers, getting involved, go work for the UN, go work in the Congress, go work in the local offices here. It's exciting.
Great. So let's leave things on a more positive note. I was wondering if you could share with me what you think some of the more recent positive developments in Africa are. We all hear so much about all the problems going on. What do you think are some of the more recent successes?
There's a lot of them. You have to remember that bad news is news, good news is rarely news. And so you very rarely hear, there were great elections, there were great progress, the country. So Rwanda is a great story. It's risen out of the ashes of the genocide and become an engine of growth there. South Africa today is a good story. Tanzania is a fantastic story. It's had a good democracy. I'm actually going there to climb Mount Kilimanjaro in June. And going on a little safari. It's really interesting, it's fun, it's safe. Some of the best music comes from Africa, some of the best art comes from Africa. You've got Senegal, the Congo has some of the best music in the world. And it's a vibrant continent of 1 billion people. You have to also remember that if you look at the history of the human race, we all, literally all, came from Africa. And so we have a lot of people in common with the continent there, and get to know our roots and get to know the culture, learn another language. You can join the Peace Corps, which is a great way to get there. It's a 2-year commitment that goes like that, and you'll learn another language, invite someone into your home from another country for a junior year, share it, and get to know the world. It's a fascinating place. Jacksonville's a wonderful town, but it's tiny compared to the rest of the world.
Yep, that it is. Well, great. Thank you for your
My
time.
pleasure. And if your students have any follow-up questions, have them send them to you, and I promise I'll answer them.
Great. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Excellent. Excellent.
Those are
Okay.
good
Oh my
questions.
God.